Every time you look at a hyperrealistic AI-generated image, you are basically looking at a magic trick.
Right, a really complex one.
A massive high-resolution picture was forcefully packed into this tiny microscopic mathematical box and then unpacked again. Welcome to today's deep dive.
And the real problem is doing that without losing the fine details, like the texture of a sweater or the reflection in a window.
Today we're looking at how to build that perfect mathematical box. Our mission is to unpack the balancing act of making AI image and video generation incredibly detailed and computationally efficient at the same time.
We are drawing entirely on a highly technical 2026 paper from Google DeepMind. It's titled Unified Latents: How to Train Your Latents.
To really understand the framework DeepMind built, we have to look at the necessity of latent representations in diffusion models.
Yeah, diffusion models require these compact encodings to scale efficiently to higher resolutions. Those encodings are what we call latents.
But establishing them creates a fundamental trade-off, right?
It does. If the structure of a latent is easy for the model to learn, it has a lower information density.
Yeah.
And you inevitably lose high-frequency information.
Which translates directly to worse reconstruction quality. The paper mentions measuring that quality using peak signal-to-noise ratio, or PSNR.
Think of the signal as the true, pristine image data you want to keep. The noise is the distortion introduced by the compression.
So for someone not staring at metrics all day, what does a low PSNR actually look like?
Well, a high PSNR means the signal overpowers the noise, so the image is crisp. When the PSNR drops because the latent structure is too simple,
The noise becomes visible.
yes, you end up with blurry edges, pixelated blocks, or weird color banding. It makes the image look obviously artificial.
On the flip side, if you increase the latent's information capacity for near-perfect reconstruction, the PSNR goes up.
But then the model requires massive computational modeling capacity to handle all that data.
Which brings to mind compressing a massive raw photograph into a tiny ZIP file on your computer.
That is a great way to think about it.
If you compress that file too aggressively to save space, the latent structure is simple, but the photo becomes a blurry mess when you open it. The PSNR is low.
And if you keep all the raw data intact so the image is pristine, the file is incredibly huge. Your computer takes forever to process it. You are stuck in a ZIP file dilemma.
Right. So theoretically, couldn't a single unregularized latent channel operating as a continuous variable encode infinite information?
In theory, yes. That sounds like an easy solution. But in practice, that capacity is strictly limited by machine precision and encoder smoothness.
How so? I mean, if the hardware supports, say, 32 bits, why can't the model just fill up all 32 bits with image data?
Because the model still has to map the continuous latent space smoothly. If you pack every single floating point fraction with data, the slightest shift in the space results in a totally different image.
Oh, wow. The math just becomes too chaotic for the neural network.
Right, so you have to choose your channel count carefully. Fewer channels make latents easier to model, but it ruins reconstruction.
Adding more channels gives you space for data, but demands immense modeling power. The researchers really needed a systematic way to navigate this.
They did. They fundamentally rethought how latents are regularized before handing them off to the diffusion model.
And the solution they developed is the Unified Latents framework. It rests on 3 key ideas, focusing heavily on the encoder.
The primary mechanism is co-training a diffusion prior directly on the latents themselves.
Unpacking that first key idea reveals a major departure from standard practices, actually.
DeepMind decided not to use a flexible distribution that lets the model learn the noise level.
Right. Instead, the Unified Latents approach encodes latents with a fixed amount of Gaussian noise.
They use a deterministic latent encoding that is forward noise to time 0. The specific mathematical boundary they set is a final log signal-to-noise ratio, or log SNR, of 5.
To put that in perspective, standard models often let the noise variance fluctuate based on the data.
But by locking it at a log SNR of 5, they impose a very rigid limit on the noise scale right at the beginning. The latent is sampled using a learned mean, but the noise added is fixed and diagonal.
I have to challenge this design choice. Isn't the entire premise of deep learning to let the AI learn the parameters?
That is usually the goal, yes.
Freezing the noise level and forcing a deterministic encoding feels completely counterintuitive. Why would restricting the model actually improve performance?
Well, allowing the model to learn the noise distribution introduces entropy terms into the mathematical objective.
Okay, what does that mean for the training?
When you allow the encoder to predict both a mean and a variance, a specific function called the generalized callback libelo penalty kicks in. We usually just call it the KL penalty.
Which is basically a mathematical way of penalizing the model for getting too complex.
The KL penalty subtracts the encoder's entropy from the standard entropy of the system. In a noisy, latent setting, the model seeks the path of least resistance.
To minimize that penalty.
Yes. The mathematics show the easiest way for the model to avoid the penalty is just to drop the learned noise to absolute zero.
Wait, really? It just turns the noise off entirely.
It does. And when the noise zeroes out, it severely destabilizes the model during training. The diffusion process requires a stable gradient of noise to function.
So the model basically tries to cheat the test, which breaks the system.
That summarizes the mechanism perfectly. The researchers solved this by linking the encoder's output noise directly to the prior's minimum noise level.
Bypassing the entropy problem entirely.
Right. The KL penalty is removed from the equation because the noise is no longer a learned variable.
Creating a simple, stable training objective, it provides a tight upper bound on the latent bitrate.
Meaning the maximum amount of information the latent can hold is strictly controlled.
Okay, so with the encoder perfectly tuned and stable, the data is compressed efficiently into our mathematical box.
The next step is unpacking that data and turning it back into an image.
And that introduces a completely new bottleneck. The model gets a little too smart for its own good here.
The unpacking process is handled by a specific architecture called the Unified Diffusion decoder.
This operates entirely in image space, conditioned on two things: the noisy data and the latent we just generated.
But when a UNet decoder is incredibly powerful, it can trigger a phenomenon known as posterior collapse.
Hold on, posterior collapse sounds catastrophic for the system.
It is a major issue. Posterior collapse happens when the decoder bypasses the latent entirely. It tries to generate the image based solely on the noisy data.
So it completely ignores the data we just spent all this time perfectly compressing.
Yes, it decides the latent information is unnecessary to minimize its immediate training loss.
Imagine the UNet decoder as an arrogant master chef, and the latent data is a very specific, carefully crafted recipe.
The chef is highly skilled.
So skilled they might just look at the raw ingredients, the noisy data, ignore the provided recipe, and cook a dish completely from scratch.
Based purely on their own assumptions. That is posterior collapse.
The dish might look okay, but it is not the recipe you asked for at all.
To prevent the decoder from ignoring the latent, the researchers introduced a mechanism called a loss factor. It's usually set between 1.3 and 1.7.
This loss factor explicitly forces the model to use the latent data.
By upweighing the decoder's reweighted evidence lower bound loss.
We should break down that evidence lower bound loss, or ELBO. What does upweighing it physically do to the model?
ELBO is a mathematical function that calculates the difference between the generated image and the original true image. It penalizes the model for any deviations.
So by applying a loss factor to upweigh the ELBO, you are artificially increasing the penalty.
Returning to our arrogant master chef, the loss factor acts like a strict restaurant owner stepping into the kitchen.
The owner heavily penalizes the chef financially if they deviate even slightly from the exact recipe provided.
It forces the chef to read the latent data. The mathematical consequence is direct control over the bits in the latent.
The researchers found that adjusting the loss factor, along with the bias in the sigmoid loss function, controls the information retained.
Higher loss factors represent a harsher penalty. They result in more informative latents and much better visual reconstructions.
Because the decoder is forced to utilize every bit of data.
But the trade-off is that those higher loss factors pass the burden of complex modeling directly onto the base model.
The decoder will always model high-frequency features if the cost per bit of information is lower.
You just have to constantly tune the bitrate to avoid overwhelming the computational system.
This strict setup works flawlessly for the initial training stage. The encoder, prior, and decoder learn to operate together.
But achieving state-of-the-art visual generation on industry benchmarks required a crucial second stage of training.
Stage 1 relies on an unweighted ELBO loss for the prior.
An unweighted loss assigns equal weight to low-frequency and high-frequency content across the board.
From a purely mathematical standpoint, that makes sense. All data is treated equally.
However, human perception does not value all frequencies equally. We care about sharp edges and clear shapes, not imperceptible background static.
So the visual samples from a purely unweighted prior are poor. The model wastes computational energy on things humans cannot even see.
Let's visualize that unweighted ELBO loss as a robotic vacuum cleaner.
Okay, A vacuum cleaner that treats a microscopic speck of dust with the same importance as a solid gold coin lying on the floor.
It spends an equal amount of battery power trying to process the dust speck as it does the gold coin.
That is incredibly inefficient. How does Stage 2 fix the vacuum cleaner?
Stage 2 addresses this by freezing the encoder and the decoder entirely. Their parameters are locked in place.
The researchers then train a new, much larger base model using a sigmoid weighting curve.
This specific weighting acts as a filter on your vacuum cleaner. It focuses the computational power squarely on the visually important details, the gold coins.
While heavily discounting the loss contributions of imperceptible high-frequency noise, the dust specks.
Retraining the prior as a base model using that sigmoid weighting leads to the benchmark performance that sets this framework apart.
On ImageNet 512, Unified Latents achieves a highly competitive fresh inception distance, or FID, of 1.4.
And it manages that while requiring fewer training floating point operations per second, or FLOPs, than models trained on standard Stable Diffusion latents.
The reduction in FLOPs is a direct result of the efficiency gain through the fixed noise and the sigmoid weighting.
The model does not waste calculations searching for an optimal noise distribution or mapping imperceptible details.
And for video generation on Kinetic 600, this framework sets a new state-of-the-art frechette video distance, or FED, of 1.3.
For text-to-image capabilities, it generated uncherry-picked prompts flawlessly.
We are talking about prompts like a frog in a sweater sitting on a rock, or a dog driving a car on a suburban street wearing funny sunglasses.
All rendered with incredibly high visual fidelity.
Considering these results, I am curious about the scaling dynamics here. Does a massive, large-scale model handle these fixed latents the same way a smaller model does?
The text reveals a clear divergence based on model capacity. Smaller models actually require lower bitrate latents.
Even though a lower bitrate slightly degrades the overall reconstruction quality.
Smaller capacity models simply lack the mathematical parameters to fit high bitrate latents properly. Pushing too much detailed information through the bottleneck overwhelms their architecture.
They choke on the data because they don't have the processing width to handle the complexity of a harsh loss factor.
Conversely, larger models are much less sensitive to latent bitrates. They possess the massive parameter counts needed to absorb the complexity.
This means they can achieve even better performance metrics when fed higher bitrates.
They take full advantage of the dense information packed into the latent by the encoder.
So they have built this highly restricted, perfectly balanced mathematical box. The noise is frozen, the decoder is penalized, and the prior is retrained with a specific weight.
My immediate thought when looking at a system this rigid is, what happens if we try to break the rules?
The researchers clearly had the same thought. They ran an extensive series of ablations to stress test the framework.
First, they looked at the spatial dimensions of the latents, testing downsampling factors from 8x all the way to 32x.
Keeping the number of latent channels fixed at 32, the reconstruction FID results were remarkably similar for both 16x and 8x downsampling.
16x downsampling yields a 32 by 32 spatial dimension. 8x downsampling yields a larger 64 by 64 dimension.
However, the 16x spatial downsampling proved easier for the decoder to model during generation,
resulting in significantly lower generation FID numbers.
They also varied the number of latent channels from 4 to 64 while keeping the spatial downsampling fixed at 32 by 32.
The framework proved mostly insensitive to the number of latent channels, provided the count wasn't too low.
At 4 or 8 channels, the encoder simply could not pass enough information to enable good reconstructions.
The mathematical bottleneck was too tight. It stripped away too much of the signal.
Let's push the stress test further. What if we just rip out their special diffusion prior entirely?
And replace it with a standard, off-the-shelf normal prior, like you would see in a classic variational autoencoder.
Training with a normal prior requires significantly higher bitrate latents just to reach an acceptable level of reconstruction quality.
Because the latents are forced to carry so many bits without the stability of the co-trained diffusion prior.
They become much more difficult to learn during the generation phase.
That difficulty severely degrades the final generation FID.
What about removing the fixed noise boundary? They locked it at a log SNR of 5. What happens if they set the log SNR to 10?
Setting the log SNR to 10 adds an extraordinarily small amount of noise, with a sigma around 0.0007.
At that extreme high precision level, the prior fails to accurately model the bitrate of the latent.
The mathematical loss simply collapses into the decoder.
The resulting reconstruction quality drops so low that training a useful base model becomes completely impossible.
The researchers also looked at the data itself to see if training the autoencoder on an out-of-distribution dataset affected the efficiency.
For context, standard Stable Diffusion uses an autoencoder trained on a completely different dataset than ImageNet.
They trained a base model using Unified Latents generated from an internal text-to-image dataset.
And found no significant difference in overall training efficiency compared to an in-distribution autoencoder.
The in-distribution models only showed a slight advantage when training small base models paired with a low information latent.
It really highlights the overall robustness of fixing the encoder noise and linking it directly to the prior.
Bringing this all together, we started by looking at the fundamental trade-off between image detail and compression.
The bottleneck that limits AI generation. We explored how the Unified Latents framework solved this by linking a fixed encoder noise level directly to a diffusion prior.
Preventing the system from zeroing out its own noise to avoid mathematical penalties.
We saw how a strict loss factor was introduced to force the UNet decoder to actually pay attention to the specific recipe of the latent data,
rather than ignoring it and cooking from scratch.
Finally, we saw how retraining the prior as a base model with a sigmoid weighting filter achieved state-of-the-art generation efficiency on major image and video benchmarks.
The entire methodology relies heavily on bounding the continuous latent space.
The mathematical equations, particularly the evidence lower bound formulation decomposed over various noise levels, provided a mechanism to tune the latent bitrate with precision.
The parameters were restricted, the noise variance was locked, and the entropy terms were removed from the encoder distribution.
That brings us to a final thought for you to ponder, based on the source's methodology. Consider the profound power of constraint in machine learning.
We often assume that an advanced system becomes more capable the more freedom it has to learn every single variable.
Yet here, an image generation model achieves state-of-the-art efficiency not by maximizing its learning freedom, but by intentionally freezing the noise variance to create a rigid, stable mathematical boundary.
If enforcing a strict limitation is the key to unlocking performance here.
In what other complex continuous data systems might introducing a rigid mathematical boundary be the secret to untangling the chaos? Think back to that tiny mathematical box packing away a massive image.
Sometimes, making the walls of the box completely unmoving is the only way to ensure the picture survives the compression.